I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell. Your countries are being ruined. You're destroying your countries. They're being destroyed. And I'm really good at predicting things, you know. They actually said during the campaign, they had a hat, the best-selling hat. Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything. Everyone says that I should get the Nobel Peace Prize for each one of these achievements. In my first term, I built the greatest economy in the history of the world. We had the best economy ever, history of the world. And I'm doing the same thing again, but this time it's actually much bigger and even better. We are the hottest country anywhere in the world, and there is no other country even close. On the world stage, America is respected again like it has never been respected before.
There are profound geopolitical shifts happening in the world today. The global balance of power is increasingly multipolar, and the situation today is very different from the unipolar order we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s, in which the United States was by far the most powerful country in the world, and the US essentially dominated the entire global political, economic, and financial system. The biggest change in the past 30 years has been the rise of China. In 2016, China overtook the United States as the largest economy on Earth when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. As of April 2025, China made up nearly 20% of the global economy, and China's share is growing over time, whereas the US made up less than 15% of the global economy, and the US share is shrinking over time. Moreover, China has become the world's manufacturing superpower, representing roughly 1/3 of global manufacturing output, and the US share of global manufacturing has been falling for decades. So economically, the situation in the world today is obviously very different. Politically as well, China is pushing for a new kind of international system. And today I'm going to be talking about the very different ways in which China and the United States see the world. Because the US is a global empire, the US has nearly 800 military bases all around the world. The US is engaged in more than 250 military interventions just since 1991, the year of the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the end of the First Cold War. But it's obvious to more and more people today that the US empire is in significant decline, whereas China is rising. And a lot of people ask, how does China see the world? What kind of international order would China like to help to create? And I think the best way to compare the US vision of the world and the Chinese vision of the world are the speeches that were delivered at the United Nations General Assembly this September. Symbolically, you can see how China's vision of the world is diametrically opposed to the US vision of the world. Now, I already started this analysis today playing some clips from the speech that Trump delivered at the UN General Assembly, which was a bizarre, rambling speech in which Trump condemned other countries.
Your countries are going to hell. Your countries are being ruined.
He claimed that other countries are destroying themselves and they're run by stupid leaders. Trump boasted that the United States is the greatest country ever in history.
We are the hottest country anywhere in the world, and there is no other country even close.
He showed extreme arrogance, claiming that he has been right about everything. He's never been wrong about anything.
The best-selling hat. Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything.
And Trump attacked multilateralism. He attacked the United Nations as an institution. He said essentially that the United States is going to do whatever it wants. It doesn't care about the rest of the world. Other countries have to either go along with the US or the US will attack them with tariffs and sanctions and other aggressive measures. Trump's speech, in short, was the epitome of unilateralism. And I'm going to play more clips of Trump's speech later in this analysis today. But I should also point out that Trump symbolically spoke much more than any other leader. Now, the vast majority of leaders speaking at the UN General Assembly speak between 15 to 20 minutes. Trump spoke for an hour. He spoke 3 times longer than almost every other leader. But today I also want to compare Trump's speech to the speech that was delivered by China's premier, Qiang, who's the number 2 official in China after President Xi Jinping. And Qiang delivered a very different speech. It was completely the opposite of the speech that Trump delivered. Trump's speech was all about the United States, and it was all about him personally. He was speaking on an international stage. He was speaking to other leaders, but he made so much of his speech about the US, claiming that it's the best country ever and he's the best leader ever. China's speech was the opposite. Premier Qiang talked about how China is working with other countries to support multilateralism to build a more multipolar world pursuing peace and development. That was the most important theme in the Chinese premier's speech, that what Beijing wants is a more peaceful world in which the countries of the global south can come together and economically develop and lift their people out of poverty. China does not want conflict. China has not fought a war since 1979, whereas the US is constantly waging multiple wars around the world every single year. So again, at the beginning of this analysis today, I already played some clips from Trump's speech at the UN. Here are a few clips that summarize the main points of the speech delivered by China's premier, in which he emphasizes the key points, which is that China wants a peaceful world seeking development. China supports multilateralism and multipolarity. It wants all countries, regardless of size, to have an equal opportunity. And China supports an international law-based order centered in the United Nations, as opposed to the unilateral might makes right kind of order that the US empire is supporting based on imposing its own will on other countries through aggressive policies like tariffs and military intervention. Compare these two speeches here.
Today, as the desire for peace and development grows even stronger around the world, it is incumbent upon our generation to further strengthen the force for peace and development. Solidarity and cooperation are the most powerful drivers for human progress. Solidarity lifts everyone up, while division drags all down. With an international system centered around the UN and an international order based on international law, only when all countries, big or small, are treated as equals and true multilateralism is practiced, can the rights and interests of all parties be better protected.
Now, when you listen to these speeches back to back, as I'll show today, clips from both, it's very obvious which country is the adult in the room. It's not the United States. China is a much more responsible global actor that is trying to actually build a new global order in which all countries have a voice and there are opportunities for peace and development, as opposed to the chaotic violence and hegemony in the world we've seen dominated by the US empire. So again, a lot of foreigners often ask, what is China's vision of the world? What kind of global order does China want to build? Well, China's premier, Qiang, the second in command, he just outlined the very basic principles. And yes, they're kind of boring if you compare it to Trump, who's yelling at people and making jokes. Certainly Trump is more entertaining, but Trump's speech was absolutely crazy. It was pure chaos. It was extreme aggression. He was insulting the rest of the world.
Your countries are going to hell. Your countries are being ruined.
What the US vision of the world is more chaos. It's more war. It's more conflict and aggression. And in the speech delivered by China's representative, he made it clear that China opposes unilateralism and what China calls the Cold War mentality. China does not want another Cold War, which is what the US is currently waging. China talked about the importance of opposing a new Cold War and bringing about peace through dialogue and diplomacy, ending the US-sponsored Israeli war on Gaza, ending the proxy war in Ukraine. and opposing what China calls hegemonism and bullying. So this is a clear reference to the US empire, which is constantly threatening countries around the world. China refers to that as hegemonism and bullying. Listen to these very important remarks here.
The world has entered a new period of turbulence and transformation. Unilateralism and Cold War mentality are resurfacing. How could we, in the face of deplorable incidents such as humanitarian disasters, turn a blind eye to atrocities that trample blatantly on fairness and justice and sit on our own hands? How could we, when confronted with unscrupulous acts of hegemonism and bullying, remain silent and submissive for fear of might? China has been working actively to promote peace talks on hotspot issues such as the Ukraine crisis and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We should settle differences and disputes peacefully through dialogue and consultation. Persisting in camp-based confrontation or willful resort to force only drives peace further away.
So those were the main points delivered in the speech by China's premier Li Qiang, which, by the way, was only 20 minutes. Trump's speech was 3 times as long. And I will play more clips of the Chinese representative's speech, but now I want to go back to Trump's speech at the UN General Assembly. He began this speech talking about how the US is the greatest country ever and how he's the greatest leader. Listen to Trump's very modest opening remarks here.
1 year ago, our country was in deep trouble, but today, just 8 months into my administration, we are the hottest country anywhere in the world, and there is no other country even close. America is blessed with the strongest economy, the strongest borders, the strongest military, the strongest friendships, and the strongest spirit of any nation on the face of the earth. This is indeed the golden age of America. In my first term, I built the greatest economy in the history of the world. We had the best economy ever, history of the world. And I'm doing the same thing again, but this time it's actually much bigger and even better.
Now, I have to say, it's impossible to fact-check Trump's speech because it was full of so many lies. Just every minute, he just spewed nonstop lies. And I mean objective lies, like things that you can easily fact-check and show to be false. For instance, Trump repeatedly claimed the US has the greatest economy ever in history. This is totally ridiculous. The Financial Times, for instance, published an article in September, just a few weeks before Trump's speech, looking at internal data from financial analysts, and they found that US states making up close to 1/3 of US GDP are either in recession or at high risk of recession. So for millions of average working class Americans, their daily lives are recession. Their economy is in recession. However, the reason it looks like the US economy is growing is largely because of an enormous bubble in the tech sector, especially in artificial intelligence. And you even have top AI executives like Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, the most powerful AI company in the US. Even Sam Altman has admitted that there's a massive bubble in the AI sector, which makes the US economy look like it's growing. But for the vast majority of average working class people, their everyday economy, the real economy, is in recession. But for Trump, who's a billionaire, the thing that he actually cares about is the stock market, not the real economy. In his UN speech, he boasted about how the stock market is soaring thanks to this bubble and how he cut taxes and regulations on the rich and large corporations.
The stock market, as I said, is doing better than it's ever done. We've implemented the largest tax cuts in American history and the largest regulation cuts in American history, making this once and again the best country on earth to do business. And many of the people in this room are investing in America, and it's turned out to be an awfully good investment during this 8-month period.
Now, another blatant lie in Trump's UN speech is that he claimed that inflation has been falling to record lows under his rule.
Grocery prices are down, mortgage rates are down, and inflation has been defeated. The only thing that's up is the stock market, which just hit a record high.
But the exact opposite is happening. Inflation is in fact stubbornly high in the US, and Trump's tariffs have only made inflation worse because importers, companies in the US that import products produced abroad, they pay the tariffs, not foreign countries, which is a lie Trump often repeats. He thinks if you repeat a lie enough that it becomes true. It doesn't. Well, what's actually happening is that these importers in the US are now passing on the cost of these tariffs, of Trump's tax on consumption. They're passing the cost of that tax onto average US consumers, everyday working class Americans. So inflation is not coming down, it's rising. Another blatant lie is that Trump claimed that electricity prices are coming down in the US, which is totally absurd. It's totally false.
European electricity bills are now 4 to 5 times more expensive than those in China, and 2 to 3 times higher than the United States, and our bills are coming way down.
The opposite is happening. Electricity prices are going out of control in the US, largely because of the AI bubble. And meanwhile, Trump is shutting down renewable energy projects. Instead of building out more energy, he's shutting down solar plants and wind turbines, which is only making electricity even more expensive for average working class Americans. Another lie that Trump said in his UN speech was that supposedly there are more and more jobs for working class Americans and the economy is doing so well. In fact, job growth has been slowing to a halt, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, actually revised its data showing there were over 900,000 fewer jobs created in the US. But Trump actually ironically fired the previous chief of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because he didn't like the data they were reporting. So now no one in the world can even trust the data that the US government is reporting. Now, another lie that Trump spewed in this UN speech was he claimed that he is so popular and his approval rating is higher than ever. Now, I already mentioned how this is completely inappropriate to talk about at the United Nations. You're supposed to be speaking to other world leaders on the international stage. But again, Trump makes everything about himself. Listen to this clip and then I'll fact check it.
I mean, I was very proud to see this morning I have the highest poll numbers I've ever had. Part of it is because of what we've done on the border. I guess the other part is what we've done in the economy.
So what's the reality? Well, as of the 27th of September, Trump's net approval rating was negative 17%. He only had an approval rating of 39% with a disapproval rating of 56%. The majority of Americans are against Trump and his policies. So those are just some of the obvious lies that Trump spewed in this UN speech that were very easy to disprove. Another more insidious lie that Trump has constantly reiterated is that he has claimed to end 7 wars. Now, this is completely false, and many of the countries where Trump claims that he supposedly ended a war have said, no, Trump did not end a war in our country. But listen to Trump here take credit for supposedly ending these wars, and then he attacks the United Nations. And this is one of the main points I want to emphasize. Throughout the speech, Trump attacks the UN, and he essentially says that the US empire is going to do whatever it wants. He supports a unilateral global system, or a unipolar system dominated by the United States. Contrast that to China's vision of a multipolar and a multilateral system based on international law centered in the United Nations. Listen to Trump here say the opposite.
Likewise, in a period of just 7 months, I have ended 7 unendable wars. They said they were unendable. No president or prime minister, and for that matter, no other country has ever done anything close to that. And I did it in just 7 months. It's never happened before. There's never been anything like that. I'm very honored to have done it. It's too bad that I had to do these things instead of the United Nations doing them. And sadly, in all cases, the United Nations did not even try to help in any of them. That being the case, what is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential. I've always said it. It has such tremendous, tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. For the most part, at least for now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. It's empty words.
Now, the intention of Trump's speech is to attack the United Nations in order to undermine multilateralism and multipolarity. That is to say, to defend the US empire's unipolarity and unilateralism. However, there was something that Trump said there that I do agree with. The UN does have a lot of potential, but the UN is not living up to that potential. The UN has not been able to stop wars, that's true, like a prime example is the US-sponsored Israeli war on Gaza. And why has the UN been ineffective? Because the US has been using its veto power in the UN Security Council to stop any resolution that would actually end the war and bring about peace. The Trump administration itself has continued to do this. Now, of course, the Joe Biden administration used its veto power 4 times between October 2023 and the end of his term in January 2025. 4 vetoes to kill Security Council resolutions calling for peace in Gaza. But since Trump entered office in January 2025, his administration also used the veto in the Security Council twice in order to kill 2 other resolutions that called for peace and a ceasefire in Gaza. So Trump is actually right, but not in the way that he means. The UN does have a lot of potential, but it's the United States, it's the US empire, and its obsession on creating a unipolar system in which the US does whatever it wants unilaterally, without respect for international law, without respect for multilateralism. It is the US that is sabotaging the United Nations and preventing the international law-based order from stopping these wars that the US is sponsoring around the world. Now compare Trump's remarks there to the speech delivered by China's premier Li Qiang, in which he defends the United Nations but says that the UN needs to be reformed in order to give more power and more of a voice to the global South, to developing countries. It's the US that has prevented the reform of the UN. It's the US that has prevented global South countries, formerly colonized countries, from having more of a say. It's the US that's standing in the way of multipolarity and international democracy. Listen to the Chinese representative's remarks here.
China stands ready to work with all members to uphold the standing and authority of the UN, safeguard the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, support UN reforms to improve its efficiency and capacity to fulfill its mandate, and advocate greater representation and voice of developing countries. China will work with the UN to set up a China-UN Global South-South Development Facility and provide it with $10 million in budgetary support. China will also partner with the United Nations Development Program to establish a global center for sustainable development in Shanghai to accelerate the implementation of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
This is why China emphasized that it called for the creation of a new initiative called the Global Governance Initiative, which is aimed at reforming these international institutions like the UN so they're actually multilateral and actually democratic and not dominated by the US-led West. Here, China outlines its vision for the Global Governance Initiative and how it's based on equality, international law, and respect for the sovereignty of nations.
The Global Governance Initiative, proposed at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Tianjin Summit at the beginning of this month, underscores the principles of adhering to sovereign equality, abiding by international rule of law, practicing multilateralism, advocating the people-centered approach, and focusing on taking real actions. It points the right direction and provides an important pathway for building a more just and equitable global governance system.
Now, I already mentioned how Trump opened up his UN General Assembly speech talking about how the US is the greatest country ever and he's the best leader. Well, how did China's representative open his speech? Li Qiang emphasized the importance of the United Nations because 2025 is the 80th anniversary. And in particular, he emphasized that the UN was created after the victory over fascism in World War II, which China refers to as the World Anti-Fascist War. And he said that China wants to strengthen and reform the UN so it can prevent future wars, and what is implied here is so it can oppose fascism. And the clear implication here, he didn't say this, but the clear implication is that the US empire is becoming more and more fascist. And this is why it's important to defend multilateralism and multipolarity against the unilateral, unipolar attacks by the US empire. Listen here.
This year marks the 80th anniversary of the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War. It is also the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. 80 years ago, fascism was defeated in fearless battles by countless heroic men and women around the world, and the United Nations was created upon their ideal of a world free of war. The past 80 years have been tortuous but purposeful. Peace and development are the strongest aspiration shared by the people of all countries. Having gone through 2 world wars, we must never forget the bitter lessons learned through bloodshed and loss of lives.
Now, I already emphasized how it's completely false that Trump has ended these 7 wars. It's not true. And right now, as we speak, Trump is continuing to wage war, a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. And Trump is sponsoring the horrific, bloody war that Israel is waging on the people of Palestine in Gaza in blatant violation of international law. And yet in his UN speech, he talked about how everyone says that supposedly he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. This is something that Trump is obsessed with. He really, really wants a Nobel Peace Prize.
Now, after ending all of these wars and also earlier negotiating the Abraham Accords, which is a very big thing for which our country received no credit, never receives credit. Everyone says that I should get the Nobel Peace Prize for each one of these achievements.
But then in the same speech, just a few minutes later, Trump boasted about how he waged war on Iran. Trump bragged that he killed the top officers in Iran's military, and he boasted of bombing Iran, and then he bragged that the US has the greatest military equipment and weapons on earth. This is the guy who says that he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize.
Just as I did in my first term, I've made containing these threats a top priority, starting with the nation of Iran. Today, many of Iran's former military commanders, in fact, I can say almost all of them, are no longer with us. They're dead. And 3 months ago, in Operation Midnight Hammer, 7 American B-2 bombers dropped the 14 30,000-pound each bombs on Iran's key nuclear facilities, totally obliterating everything. No other country on earth could have done what we did. No other country has the equipment to do what we did. We have the greatest weapons on earth.
Then, a few minutes after that, Trump boasted about how he's bombing Venezuelan boats, claiming without any evidence that supposedly they're full of drugs. Again, there's no evidence of that. So he's boasting of threatening and attacking Venezuela, and he also threatened Venezuela's constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro, implying very strongly that the U.S. wants to overthrow Venezuela's president while he's giving a speech at the UN talking about how supposedly he wants peace.
You see this, and you see it happening right before your eyes. Let's put it this way. People don't like taking big loads of drugs in boats anymore. There aren't too many boats that are traveling on the seas by Venezuela. They tend not to want to travel very quickly anymore. For this reason, we've recently begun using the supreme power of the United States military to destroy Venezuelan terrorists and trafficking networks led by Nicolás Maduro. To every terrorist thug smuggling poisonous drugs into the United States of America, please be warned that we will blow you out of existence. That's what we're doing.
Trump, the so-called peacemaker, also boasted of how he forced European members of NATO to more than double their military spending from 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP. Again, this is preparing for more war, not peace.
At the NATO summit in June, virtually all NATO members formally committed to increase defense spending at my request from 2% to 5% of GDP, making our alliance far stronger and more powerful than it was ever before.
Now, there were two other main themes in the speech that Trump delivered at the UN, in addition to his main point about how the US is the greatest country ever with the greatest economy, and he's the glorious best leader ever who's right about everything. He's never been wrong. He's never made an error. Well, in addition to that obvious nonsense, Trump emphasized two other main points. One, he attacked immigration and immigrants. He dehumanized immigrants in the global South. And he talked about how immigrants are supposedly invading countries, and that's why he has to stop them. And he totally falsely claimed that the United Nations is funding immigrants to supposedly invade the US, a complete lie. And he also insanely claimed that immigrants are trying to impose Sharia law in London, in the UK, another ridiculous lie. Listen to these insane rants here of a man who's nearly 80 years old. And yes, I'm going to say what everyone is thinking. We all know it's the elephant in the room. He's obviously suffering from dementia, like Joe Biden. And he loves to make fun of Biden, who obviously was also suffering from dementia. But they're very similar in that way. Listen here.
And other countries have no choice because other countries are in the exact same situation with immigration. It's destroying your country. Not only is the UN not solving the problems it should, too often, it's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the number one political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. Your countries are being ruined. The United Nations is funding an assault on Western countries and their borders. I'm not mentioning names. I see it, and I could call every single one of them out. You're destroying your countries. They're being destroyed. Europe is in serious trouble. They've been invaded by a force of illegal aliens like nobody's ever seen before. I look at London, where you have a terrible mayor, terrible mayor, and it's been so changed. Now they want to go to Sharia law. But you're in a different country. You can't do that.
Now, here's another example of how it's very interesting to compare this to the speech given by China's premier, Qiang. The Chinese representative emphasized how all civilizations around the world are worthy of respect. This is why China launched the Global Civilization Initiative. And he said that there are no civilizations that are superior to others, which is another clear reference to the racism of Trump and these Western politicians who say that the West is the best, that white Greco-Roman civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization is supposedly better than all other civilizations in the history of humanity. China is saying, no, every civilization is worthy of respect. And this kind of racism that is sponsored by Western governments actually leads to more conflict and violence.
Every civilization has its unique value and heritage, and deserves acknowledgement and respect. Obsession with so-called civilizational superiority or ideology-based circles only breeds more division and confrontation.
Now, I mentioned that there was one other main theme of Trump's speech at the UN, which was his insane rant about how supposedly climate change is all a scam, and he strongly implied that it's a Chinese scam. And Trump has tweeted before that supposedly China made up climate change, which is completely absurd. The vast majority of serious climate scientists around the world today say that anthropogenic climate change is a serious threat. It has been caused by human activity and by carbon emissions. And the US is per capita one of the largest carbon emitters on Earth, along with other Western countries, which historically are responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions. And yet Trump just wants to erase all of that, and he claims falsely that it's all a scam, and he attacks China and claims that renewable energy doesn't work. Listen to his absurd lies here. and then I'll fact check him.
We're getting rid of the falsely named renewables. By the way, they're a joke. They don't work. And most of them are built in China, and I give China a lot of credit. They build them, but they have very few wind farms. So why is it that they build them and they send them all over the world, but they barely use them? If you don't get away from this green scam, your country is going to fail. And I'm really good at predicting things, you know. They actually said during the campaign, they had a hat, the best-selling hat. Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything. And I'm telling you that if you don't get away from the green energy scam, your country is going to fail.
That is all completely false. Let's look at the facts. As of 2024, China had installed more wind power capacity than the rest of the world combined, than all of the world combined. China has also already installed more than 3 times the wind power capacity of the United States. And the growth rate in China's wind power capacity is 18% per year, whereas in the US, it's 0%. And it's not just wind, but also solar power. China is the world leader in solar and wind and also nuclear and other green sources of energy. In fact, Yale University published data in 2024 showing that China is building twice as much wind and solar power capacity as the rest of the world combined. Twice as much, including over 8 times as much as the US. Now, China, in addition to having a socialist system in which the government is directing investment into these strategic sectors to fight climate change and also to have energy security, so China is not as dependent on importing oil and natural gas. In addition to all of that, the Chinese government is run by engineers and scientists, and they highly value scientific research, unlike the US, which is run by a bunch of ignorant climate science deniers who failed science in high school, and yet they think they know more about science than the world's leading climate scientists. Well, if you listen to the speech given by China's Premier Li at the UN General Assembly, he made it clear that China takes climate change very seriously, that unlike Trump, who attacked the Paris Climate Accord.
That's why in America I withdrew from the fake Paris Climate Accord.
China supports the Paris Climate Agreement and the legally binding goals that were set in that agreement. By the way, China is going to actually meet those legally binding goals early, whereas the US is never going to meet them on its current track. So again, listen to how there's a 180-degree contrast between how China sees the world, as reflected in this speech, and how the US empire sees the world, as reflected in Trump's speech.
Climate change is a major challenge confronting all of us. We should uphold the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, promote the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement, and enhance international collaboration on the green economy.
Now, part of this transition toward green and renewable energy sources is that China emphasizes the importance of science and technology for benefiting humanity, for helping to reduce poverty and bring about development. Listen here to how China supports sharing technology to benefit human development.
We should adhere to the principles of people-centered development, technology for good, and equitable benefits. Improve relevant governance rules at a faster pace, and strengthen global governance cooperation, so that technological progress could bring real benefits to humanity in a better way. China has proposed the Global AI Governance Initiative and advocated the establishment of a World AI Cooperation Organization.
So it's so obvious listening to these remarks that China represents the future of humanity. China is looking into the future, looking at these new technologies, thinking about how they can be used to liberate humanity, to end poverty, to develop economies in formerly colonized countries. Meanwhile, the US empire is looking back into the past, back to the 1990s, when the US empire controlled the world in a unipolar world. That's what the US wants to go back to. This is why Trump is attacking multilateralism and the United Nations. But Trump wants to go back even further. He wants to go back to the 19th century, to the Gilded Age. And one of the reasons why Trump constantly attacks climate science and falsely claims that climate change is a hoax is because it's in the economic interests of U.S. fossil fuel corporations, because the U.S. is now the #1 producer of oil and gas on Earth and the #1 exporter. And in his UN General Assembly speech, Trump boasted about that. And this is why he told other countries, we're going to threaten you to buy more oil and gas from us. And if you don't, we'll impose more tariffs on you and sanctions and restrictions. His goal is to help the oil and gas industry and his billionaire oligarch friends in these big corporations. Listen here.
You know, we have an expression, drill, baby, drill, and that's what we're doing. I unleash massive energy production and signed historic executive orders to hunt for oil, but we don't have to do much hunting because we have the most oil of any nation anywhere, oil and gas in the world. And if you add coal, we have the most of any nation in the world. Clean, I call it clean, beautiful coal. You can do things today with coal that you couldn't have done 10 years ago, 15 years. So I have a little standing order in the White House. Never use the word coal, only use the words clean, beautiful coal. Sounds much better, doesn't it? But we stand ready to provide any country with abundant, affordable energy supplies if you need them, when most of you do. We're proudly exporting energy all over the world. We're now the largest exporter.
So those were all of the clips that I wanted to go over today from the speeches delivered by the U.S. representative and the Chinese representative at the United Nations General Assembly. I think they very obviously speak for themselves. It's clear to humanity which country has sane, rational leadership that is committed to human development and peace and multilateralism. That country is China. It's also very clear to humanity which country is run by corrupt billionaire oligarchs who oppose science, who support chaos and destruction and war and military intervention around the world, who are constantly lying every second, who want to exploit the rest of humanity instead of helping them to reduce poverty and pursue common prosperity and development. That is the U.S. empire, which is causing chaos and war and conflict around the world. And it was perfectly illustrated by and reflected in the speech that Trump delivered at the UN General Assembly, which were the deranged ramblings of an imperial maniac.
The best-selling hat. Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything.
And everyone around the world can now see that the emperor has no clothes. This is the true face of the U.S. empire, which fortunately is the past. It represents the dark ages of human history, and China and other countries in the global south will be forging a new multipolar path toward actual progress and peace and development if the U.S. empire doesn't drag down the entire world with it as it tries to go back to the Gilded Age of the 19th century. That's what really keeps me up at night. That's what I fear, is that the U.S. empire will carry out more and more wars, like we already see it doing, potentially World War III, potentially nuclear war, to prevent the creation of a more multipolar democratic world, to try to maintain desperately the imperialist dictatorship of the U.S. empire, this unipolar system that has caused so much chaos and suffering around the world. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.